So, welcome everyone. In tonight's webinar, we're going to be having a look at poetry, and we're going to have a look at the fact that it is the secret weapon for exam success. So, when a lot of people think about what poetry is, when people hear about it, they might think it's just a short text. They might think it's something that, expresses emotion, it's written for enjoyment. All of these things are correct. But what people fail to realize is that poetry is what is needed for exam excellence. And we're going to have a look at that in tonight's session. So on my screen, it says we're going to be unlocking the power of poetry, and this is going to transform student performance across all their subjects. It is beyond artistic expression because poetry is a practical tool that builds critical thinking, vocabulary, and exam techniques. And we're going to delve into this tonight together. So it's really important, before we jump in, it's really important to understand that when students apply for some sort of exam, they're always asked to write one of two texts. It's either always the narrative or the persuasive text. There is nothing else that they'll be asked to write. So it's really important to understand, well, then how come poetry helps this when it's not something that they'll be asked to write? But when students come to write either the narrative or the persuasive, they always go into the exam knowing, for example, structure. That's very important. So if it's a persuasive text, they know they have to put in the introduction, their arguments, and then their conclusion with the call to action. If it's a narrative, they know they need to include the orientation, the complication, series of events, and then the resolution. So while all these things, they focus on all of these elements, they think about ideas, they start to generate the text, especially under a given time limit. They start to generate the text according to the stimulus, whatever topic they're given. And then students always focus on the text level, which is the structure and the ideas. Then they start looking at the paragraph level, what happens at each part of the text. They look at the sentence level when they go back to edit. They might look at things like spelling, they might look at punctuation, they might look at grammar if they're missing anything in the sentence. But what students actually miss for those very top marks is the word level detail. And this is where poetry comes in. Because when it comes to writing poetry, they have to be so focused on every single word. And when their mind is trained to think this way, write in this way, then they take those skills into their test, and that's what unlocks the really top marks, and that's what markers are looking for. All right, so let's jump in together and have a look at in a little bit more detail. So just first of all, if you don't know who I am, my name is Nadine. I have been a teacher for 10 years in the classroom as a primary teacher. I currently work as a national and international assessment consultant for ICAS assessments. During my time as teacher, I was the head of East Cater 2. I was also part of the team that wrote the New South Wales syllabus for English years 3 to 6. I'm a trained NAPLAN marker, and of course, I'm a specialist tutor, and I've been helping so many students achieve excellence. All right, so let's jump in. So, why poetry matters more than ever? And this is what people don't actually realize when it comes to learning poetry. Poetry trains the brain in ways that few other forms of writing can. And so it's not just poetry, it's also descriptive writing. So I've also just finished a course of descriptive writing with my students last term, and that's the real basis, teaching students not just about focusing on texts and quantity just yet. It's all about going back down to the paragraph and really focusing on the quality of their writing, looking at every single word, why it's written and the way that it's written on purpose. So that's the absolute foundations. And then once you learn and you master descriptive language, then we build on that by exploring poetry. And this is why I've done these courses in this order, because it's really important now to take these skills to the next level. And then, of course, we go into persuasive and then we go into the narrative. So let's have a look. The very first thing is that poetry is a vocabulary booster. While students learn poetry, they start to learn precise, powerful words and also how to use them with nuance. So here in poetry, Sometimes when we're asked to write a poem, some of them are very short, some of them are very structured, and they actually have to choose words on purpose that fit that structure and fit that purpose. And so when students are so limited to the words they can actually write, and they start to really explore words and using them on purpose, now when they learn these words and the meanings of these words, they can start applying them into other texts. So, for example, they might be writing, for example, the utmost devastation. And then now that they know what that means, because they've used it in a poem, they can then use that in a narrative if it fits. They can then use it in their persuasive text if it fits. So as they start to build this vocabulary and this whole bank of really amazing, strong words, they can start applying it to every single text that they write within the right context. The next thing is that it's a comprehension sharpener. Here, decoding layered meaning builds inferential and evaluative thinking. And we're going to have a look at that over the next few slides, that it doesn't just help them when it comes to their writing task, it also helps them in their reading comprehension. Because when it comes to poetry, it's not just about reading a story, it's not just about reading an ordinary text. When it comes to poetry, there is so much hidden meanings. There are so many layers. There are so many reasons why poets design that poem in terms of their purpose as well and the audience. So when students start to unpack that, and they start to look at why the author wrote it in that way. What happens if they change it? Learning to read between the lines, and that's what inferential means, starts to help them understand texts in a different way. So then when it comes to their reading comprehension exams, they're able to see it and they're able to analyze immediately in that evaluative thinking. The next thing is that it's a literary technique developer. During poetry, we teach metaphor, we teach tone, mood, and symbolism. And all of these are common in high stakes exam, whichever one that is. So we will be looking at all of these things in detail. They'll be learning to identify it. First, they'll know what it is. They'll learn to identify it. Then they'll learn to use it in their writing. And so when they come to analyze it in that way, and then they start to incorporate it within their texts, this is now something that they can see. This is something that they can use. And then that's how they quickly answer questions on time, or they're able to incorporate in that their writing, of course, in time. And the last thing is that it's a memory enhancer. We have aspects of rhythm, repetition, and rhyme, and all of these anchor their learning and improve their fluency. And on the side there, it just says it so beautifully. In poetry, every word works. And in exams, that's exactly what markers are looking for. It's not just the whole text, it's not just paragraph, sentence level, it's now word level and keeping it consistent in every single word they use. And that's when you actually unlock those very, very top marks in any of these exams. All right, so let's jump in to find out, well, how does poetry assist with creative writing success? The very first thing, as I mentioned before, it strengthens the descriptive writing abilities. So now their mind is learning a whole layer of new skills. They're starting to see texts in a different way. They themselves become an author and their voice shines in a very different way. I know some people here tonight were actually part of my term two course, and they all did an incredible job in that term to be able to find their own voice and write in a beautiful way that was so mature. I was, especially my 5 and 6 class. If you read some of their work, it's actually on my page on Facebook or Instagram, Lead and Succeed. You'd see that this is, what people think is some adults can't even achieve writing this way. It's very beautiful, mature writing. So this also, poetry is another extra layer where you can start to understand how to write in a way that takes the reader on a journey with you, and you start to put impact and emotion into your words instead of just writing a simple text. The next thing is that it teaches powerful openings and closings. And both of these are so important in both the narrative and the persuasive as well. It's so important that when you begin to write your text, you hook the reader. They want to keep reading. And of course, the closing is so important. They might have an exemplary text, but then coming to the end, it just doesn't do anything for you. You need to have, and what they learn is that you need to have a really powerful statement at the end. It should stir emotion, it should encourage reflection. And this is what students start to learn to incorporate in their own texts. The next thing is that it builds this capacity to show and not just tell. We always speak about this as an important part to text, particularly the narrative. But in poetry, this is how they start to develop that skill because they have to tie in that emotion, that experience, that connection to the audience. The next is that it develops this emotional depth and this authentic voice. And again, when students can do this, this is when they start to unlock the very high marks in the test and in that rubric, because now you're starting to shake the reader. And of course, creating originality through metaphor and imagery, that students are now not just writing in literal terms, but they're starting to write metaphorically. They're starting to create these beautiful images that are painted through their words. And again, this skill is so important for exam success. So students who can think poetically write creatively. It gives them emotional depth, voice, and originality. And of course, poetry provides students with the tools to transform ordinary writing into extraordinary expression that captivates the examiners. And that's exactly what we're after. The next thing is that poetry also assists comprehension mastery. Here are the aspects that we explore. So this is not just when it comes to writing, but also reading poetry. And when you do it, you need to do both. You need to have a look at some really strong example texts. You analyze that and then allow your children to write their own. So now we're starting to look at the reading and the writing aspect of it. The first thing is that it encourages deep reading. Poetry teaches students to look beyond the surface meaning and start to decode the subtleties in texts. The subtleties are the very small things, the details. It comes down to individual words. Why did the author use this word? What would happen to this text if he changed this word to this word instead? What about the punctuation? Here's a question, but what happens if they actually exclaimed it? What happens if they put an ellipsis instead? So, how does that change the text? How does it build the text? And when students start to analyze really down to the detail, it helps them develop that skills to translate to other texts that they read in other tests and in their work at school. The next thing is that they read between the lines. Students develop habits of inferring tone, figurative meaning, and shifts in viewpoint. So again, because, for example, in our course that's coming up, this is what we do. We start to break down these texts. I encourage you to do it at home. Break down text and ask questions like, what is the author trying to convey? What is the tone? And what happens? And which words do you know are contributing to that tone? And then what happens if we change it in this way? Or identify figurative meaning. This, what is the author trying to say when he's saying this line? What does that mean? And so when you start to really delve into these details, students start to pick up on these things much more quicker. The next one is critical analysis. Poetry builds the exact skills needed for NAPLAN and other high stakes exams. And again, in the comprehension text or in the English text, when it comes to reading, they actually put so many of these devices in the text to see which students understand it. They have three types of questioning. The first is the literal question, it's right there in the text, the inferential, reading between the lines, and then the applied. And both of the inferential and the applied questions, the harder types of questions, students develop those skills in reading through that and understanding meaning through poetry. And of course, exam excellence. High-performing students consistently demonstrate poetic thinking in their reading responses because now they're used to reading in this way. They're used to identifying these details straight away when a question comes up. Yep, I know it. I've seen it. I've done it before. Instead of children who've never thought in that way, especially in that metaphorical way, or they're not really good at analyzing text and finding hidden meanings. They don't really know what the author is trying to say. So building these skills is extremely important. The next one is vocabulary expansion. So let's see how poetry accelerates their language development. Poetry exposes students to sophisticated, precise language not found in everyday text. And that's really important to recognize that they could be reading novels, they might be reading chapter books. But in terms of poetry, there is certain language that is put in there that is so different that they will not be exposed to unless they actually go in there and read it and go in there and unpack it. So that's really important. This is my favorite one, is that it teaches strategic word choice. It's economy of language, impact, and rhythm. And this is why I love teaching poetry to students because it really pushes them to challenge themselves. In poetry, sometimes there are very short texts, and I'm about to share some with you in a moment. For example, a haiku. A haiku is a three-line poem, just three lines. The first line follows a particular structure. First line, 5 syllables. Second line, 7 syllables. Last line, 5 syllables. So because it's such a short poem, it is so difficult because students have the economy of language. They have to choose every single word on purpose and deliberately to be able to create this incredible poem, not just putting any words together. They need to also count the syllables to make sure that it's the correct type of poem. But here, when students are pushed to a corner and they have limited use of words, this is where their creativity starts to shine. This is where tools like the thesaurus and the dictionary are so powerful to the authors or the children because now they really need to start looking up words that they can use that fit in the right context and convey that right message. So let's have a look at some together. Although a very short poem, when produced correctly, can have so much impact. And this is what we need to start teaching our children to play with words, but in a really impactful way. So here we've got 3 different haikus showing 3 types of emotions. The first one is grief. The world keeps turning. My breath caught in yesterday. You are still not here. Again, 3 lines, but so powerful, showing that someone's grief and someone's pain, that they're just not around that person. The next one shows anxiety. I smile, but inside, my thoughts pace a caged circle. No one sees the wall. Again, so powerful here, using beautiful personification, beautiful metaphor in that second line. Resilience. They buried me deep, but forgot I was a seed. I rise through the cracks. Again, so small, yet so powerful and so beautiful. And this is what we start to teach students when it comes to poetry writing, that they need to write with impact. It's every word is there on purpose. Everything is there to create emotion, to stir emotion, to think in a different way. And this is why poetry is so fun. And this is why students really love poetry, because they start to find their voice. And by the end, they start to feel so proud of themselves that they've explored a whole new realm that they've never actually tried before. The next one is that it helps students understand word families and shades of meaning. And this again is so important. Word families, understanding words that rhyme. Some poems mandate rhyme. Then there needs to be, for example, this last line needs to rhyme with this line. All of these different rules that are there really pushes their mind to think in a certain way. So they have to think about, well, what rhymes here? What can I use that makes sense in context? Shades of meaning is also so powerful for students that it now starts to, as we said, it boosts their vocabulary. Now, for example, if we're writing on the topic of sadness, I can talk about grief, I can talk about sorrow, I can talk about anguish. This is now what we call shades of meaning, that it's not just sad, but there are so many layers of sadness and there are so many aspects that change that. Anguish, there's pain that's associated. We can talk about despair, that's sadness but losing hope. So when they start to learn new words and they start to understand what makes that word different to the other one, now their language becomes so precise. Now this is where they start to paint pictures in the reader's mind because, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about when you're talking about anguish or if you're talking about despair or helplessness or whatever word that they're choosing. And so this is how we start to develop powerful language. The next one is that it develops thematic depth and conceptual understanding. Now they're really zooming in on themes. They're talking about, sadness. It could be about anger. It could be about love and friendship, whatever that is. They're delving into concepts and they start to explore it. So Akara and the NAPLAN rubrics actually reward precise vocabulary, manipulation of language, and sustained imagery. And poetry teaches all three. All right. Now, in research and evidence, I did a bit of research to show you that from some of these reports and findings. So, for example, from the OECD report in 2021, it says that students who read poetry scored higher in literacy comprehension than those who only read prose. Prose are just everyday texts like narratives, newspapers or newspaper articles, whatever that is, fiction, non-fiction, but not poetry. Poetry is more of the metaphorical, the more of the imagery that comes through there. So this is students who actually scored higher. The University of Exeter study, there's a weekly poetry writing improved the metaphorical thinking and empathy. And these are skills that are linked to high performance in English exams. And from student performance data, year five students using poetry techniques showed marked improvement in persuasive writing scores and creative expression, of course, because you can bring your point across and you're writing it in a way that really captivates your audience. All right, so here are my top practical strategies for yourself at home. So the first thing that I always encourage is weekly poetry exploration. I highly recommend working with your children. Start with one poem a week. Read it, unpack it, and ask them these questions. What do you notice about the poem? What is the mood? And get them to underline. So, for example, if we say, well, this is a bit of a somber mood, it's a sad mood. Well, I want you to underline all of those words that contribute to this mood. And then they can build their vocabulary. They can build this bank so they can use it in their own writing. Explore another one. What's this mood and why is it different? How do you know? Really unpack the whole text, unpack the stanza, which is the paragraph, unpack line by line. Understand, is there rhyming? What features are here? What techniques are being used? Are there metaphors? Are there similes? Is there alliteration? Is it personification? Do they use hyperbole? What are they using and why are they using those techniques? And what effect does it have on you as the reader? So really break it down line by line, word by word. When you can start to unpack it in this way, and then get them to write their own in a similar way, in a similar tone, in a similar voice. This is how we start to build this practice. The next one is start to throw in some poetry starters. Use prompts like I am, or I feel, or I wish, getting them to write poems in that way. Or a really fun activity is create a haiku to summarize your learning. Okay, you've been learning about this topic at school, whatever that may be. Create a haiku of summarizing that topic. Again, you've got 3 lines and you've got to be so explicit with the words that you choose, making sure the syllable count is the same and is correct. Haikus are very, very hard poems to write when written beautifully. So giving them time to think about it and throwing out topics, getting them to practice, getting them to stretch their mind and their imagination is so important. The next one is vocabulary banks. Create poetry banks for vocabulary expansion. This is so important. If children do not know words and they're not exposed to words, they won't know what to choose. Later on, when it comes to tests or creation, they won't know what to pull from because there is nothing to pull from. Whereas if they have understanding of so many different types of words and so many different examples, it becomes like a jigsaw puzzle. Yes, this is what I'm writing about. I'm going to use this word here, and then this idea here, and then this phrase here. I'm going to put it together to make a beautiful text. And that's exactly how my students in my last term course, this is how they were creating fantastic text because I created so many vocabulary banks. I gave them so many ideas, so many sentence starters, so many words. If you're going to use it in this way with their meaning, students need that. And these resources become so powerful because now they can adapt it into any type of text and any type of learning. So look at shades of sadness. As I mentioned, I gave you a couple of them there, but there are so many that you can research and create posters for yourself. Shades of all different types of emotions, so important. Color symbolism. What does the color blue represent? It could be peace and tranquility. It could be sadness. It could be whatever. So you can write down, create lists with your children for all the different types of colors and what that means. And then, of course, pushing them into different texts when you write them. And action verbs. You can also create, there are so many word banks you can create. Adjectives, it could be words instead of the word said, saying verbs. There's so many things that are really important to have there for your children as materials and resources for them to draw from. And of course, go through the meanings and then understand how to use them in context. And the last one is very important, integrate and perform. Use poetry as warm-ups before your writing tasks to really get the creative juices flowing and include performance elements to build confidence. It's one skill to be able to write a poem, but the other next skill that they need to build is their performance. That now brings out their public speaking skills. It should be speaking and listening. That's very important. They need to learn these things, especially, for example, when they get into year 5 or they get up to perform a speech, for example, telling everyone in the school why they should be voted a school captain, for example. They need to speak in a way with persuasion. It's not just about what they say, it's about how they say it, the volume, the intonation, what they emphasize, pausing. It's about gestures, all of these things that they need to build confidence. So make sure when we do poetry, it's not just about writing, but choose the element of performance as well, making them a whole rounded individual. All right, so start small. Begin with just one poem per week at home. I hope this webinar has given you enough information to understand why it's so important and what to do from here. If you feel like, yep, that's fantastic, then I highly encourage you to just get started immediately. If you think I'm not really sure where to begin, I do have a holiday poetry workshop coming up. Poetry is more than just pretty words. It's a discipline of the mind. It teaches thinking, it teaches emotion, it teaches expression. When our students master that, they're unstoppable in every literacy task. So here, for example, this is the color poem. They'll be understanding the poem structure. I'll be giving them word banks. I'll be giving them really incredible mentor texts that will read, that will analyze, that will unpack together. And then they'll have the chance to be able to create and then perform their own. Of course, they'll be given verbal feedback by myself every day, every night of that program. And it's also really important that they are exposed to listening to other students as well. And this is why group tutoring is fantastic, because your child, when it comes to a task, they think of that task in a certain way. But then when they listen to how the other students around them interpreted that task, it now opens their mind in a whole new level that they think, wow, I actually didn't think of that. Maybe next time I can incorporate that. And that's how they can draw on that. And that's how we see really solid improvement in a very short period of time. And with that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining tonight. I hope you found this lesson and this webinar insightful. And I wish you all the best and your children all the best in everything that they do. And I look forward to be a partner in their academic journey. With that, everyone, have an amazing night, and I will see you all soon.